The drill sergeant's voice cut through the humid Georgia air like a blade. "Listen up, Marines. We've got ourselves a special guest today." His eyes swept across the sweating faces of 30 hardened soldiers, then stopped on the small figure standing at attention in the back row. "Seems like someone thinks they can hang with the big boys." Laughter rippled through the ranks. It was the kind of laughter that comes before a storm, confident, dismissive, and completely unaware of what was about to unfold. Sarah Chen stood perfectly still, her 5'2" frame dwarfed by the towering Marines around her. At 22 years old, she had faced this kind of doubt her entire life. Growing up as the daughter of Chinese immigrants in a small Texas town, she had learned early that people's first impressions were rarely accurate. But today was different. Today, she wasn't trying to prove herself to high school bullies or college professors who questioned her engineering capabilities. Today, she was about to show 30 of America's finest warriors why they should never judge a fighter by their size. The training ground fell silent except for the distant sound of helicopters and the rhythmic thud of boots on concrete from other units. Sarah's heart beat steady and strong in her chest. She had trained for this moment for 3 years, pushing her body and mind to limits most people couldn't imagine. Every early morning run, every late-night study session, every moment of doubt had led to this single point in time. What happened next would change not just Sarah's life, but the entire perception of what it meant to be a warrior in the modern military. In less than 4 hours, 5 decorated Marines would be on the ground, their confidence shattered, their assumptions destroyed. This is the story of how one underestimated woman rewrote the rules of combat training and proved that the most dangerous opponents are often hiding in plain sight. Sarah Chen's journey to that training ground in Georgia began 3 years earlier in a cramped apartment in Austin, Texas. She was fresh out of college with a degree in mechanical engineering, but instead of following her classmates to corporate jobs at tech companies, she had made a decision that shocked everyone who knew her. She wanted to join the military. Her parents, David and Lynn Chen, had immigrated from Taiwan in the 1980s with nothing but determination and a belief that education was the path to the American dream. They had sacrificed everything to put Sarah through college, working double shifts at their small restaurant while she studied. The last thing they expected was for their daughter to walk away from a promising engineering career to join the armed forces. "Sarah, you're being foolish," her father had said that evening when she broke the news. "We didn't come to this country so you could go fight wars. You have opportunities we never had." But Sarah saw things differently. During her final year of college, she had attended a guest lecture by Colonel Maria Rodriguez, one of the first women to serve in Marine Force reconnaissance. The colonel spoke about the evolution of modern warfare, how technology was changing the battlefield, and how the military needed engineers who could think tactically. "The future of combat isn't just about physical strength," Colonel Rodriguez had said. "It's about intelligence, adaptability, and the ability to solve complex problems under extreme pressure. We need warriors who can outthink the enemy, not just outfight them." Those words struck something deep in Sarah's core. She had always been small, but she had never been weak. As a child, she had been bullied for being different, for being Asian in a predominantly white school, for being quiet when others expected her to be loud. But instead of breaking her, those experiences had forged her into something harder. She learned martial arts from her grandfather, who had studied Wing Chun in Hong Kong before the family moved to Taiwan. Every summer visit became a training camp where she learned not just techniques but philosophy. "Size means nothing," her grandfather would tell her in Mandarin. "Water can carve through stone, not because it is strong, but because it never gives up." In high school, she joined the wrestling team as the only girl. The coach was skeptical, her teammates were dismissive, and the other schools they competed against often protested her participation. But Sarah didn't just participate, she excelled. By her senior year, she had placed third in the state championships, defeating boys who outweighed her by 50 pounds. College brought new challenges. Engineering school was brutal, with professors who seemed to take pleasure in weeding out students they deemed unsuitable for the profession. Sarah watched as many of her female classmates dropped out or switched majors, unable to handle the constant questioning of their abilities and the subtle sabotage from male peers who saw them as invaders in their territory. But Sarah thrived on the adversity. Every time someone told her she didn't belong, she worked harder. Every time a professor suggested she might be better suited for a softer field, she stayed later in the lab. By graduation, she had the highest GPA in her class and had published 2 papers on robotics applications in extreme environments. It was during her senior year that she first heard about the Marine Corps' new integrated combat training program. The military was looking for soldiers who could combine technical expertise with combat effectiveness. They wanted engineers who could fight, programmers who could lead, and scientists who could think strategically under fire. The application process was intense. Physical fitness tests that pushed candidates to their limits, psychological evaluations that probed every corner of their minds, and technical assessments that required solving complex problems while under extreme stress. Sarah passed every stage, but barely. She was accepted into the program, but with a note in her file that she was borderline for physical requirements. The training itself was unlike anything she had ever experienced. For 18 months, she split her time between technical courses and combat training. She learned advanced weapon systems, tactical communications, and battlefield engineering while also mastering close-quarters combat, survival training, and military leadership principles. Her instructors were tough but fair. They pushed her harder than the male candidates because they knew she would face extra scrutiny in the field. "You can't just be as good as them," Master Sergeant Williams told her during a particularly grueling hand-to-hand combat session. "You have to be better, because when you're deployed, there will be people whose lives depend on your abilities, and they won't care about your gender or your size. They'll only care about whether you can do the job." Sarah took those words to heart. She trained when others rested, studied when others relaxed, and pushed herself to master every skill they taught her. She became proficient with a dozen different weapon systems, learned to speak basic Arabic and Pashto, and developed an intuitive understanding of battlefield tactics that impressed even the most seasoned instructors. But it was in the technical aspects of warfare where she truly shined. Sarah had an uncanny ability to understand complex systems quickly and find creative solutions to seemingly impossible problems. During one training exercise, her unit was tasked with disabling an enemy communication array that was heavily defended and seemingly impregnable. While her teammates focused on direct assault tactics, Sarah spent 3 hours studying the technical specifications of the array and discovered a vulnerability in the power system that allowed them to disable it with minimal casualties. Her success in the program led to her being selected for advanced combat training at the Marine Corps facility in Georgia. This was where the best of the best came to hone their skills, where elite units practiced the kind of high-stakes operations that could change the course of conflicts. Sarah arrived at the base on a humid Monday morning in June. She'd been assigned to Delta Company, a unit known for its aggressive training methods and high standards. The other members of her training class were all seasoned Marines with multiple deployments and commendations. Many of them had been in combat, had seen things that would haunt most people for the rest of their lives. And then there was Sarah, young, small, and obviously inexperienced in their eyes. The commanding officer, Colonel James Morrison, was a legend in Marine circles. He had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, led numerous successful operations, and had a reputation for being able to turn even the most unpromising recruits into effective warriors. But he was also known for his old-school attitudes about women in combat roles. "Miss Chen," he said during her arrival briefing, looking over her file with obvious skepticism, "I see you've completed the Integrated Combat Training Program. Impressive on paper. But this isn't a classroom, and it's not a lab. This is where we separate the real warriors from the wannabes." Sarah stood at attention, her expression neutral. "Yes, sir. I understand, sir." "Do you?" Morrison leaned back in his chair. "Because I've had a dozen female candidates come through this program in the past 2 years. You know how many made it through to deployment? 0. They all washed out when things got real." The implication was clear. He expected her to fail, just like all the others. But Sarah had heard variations of this speech her entire life. Teachers who told her she wasn't smart enough, coaches who said she wasn't strong enough, employers who suggested she wasn't tough enough. Each time, she had proven them wrong. "Sir, I didn't come here to be like the others," she replied calmly. "I came here to excel." Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. "We'll see about that. Report to Drill Sergeant Martinez in the morning. You'll be joining the advanced combat team for their final evaluation exercises. Try not to embarrass yourself." As Sarah left the colonel's office, she felt the familiar fire building in her chest. It was the same feeling she had experienced before every major challenge in her life. A mixture of determination, excitement, and barely controlled anger at being underestimated once again. She spent that evening in her barracks room, reviewing the training manuals and studying the profiles of her new teammates. There were 30 Marines in her training group, all men, all with impressive service records. Staff Sergeant Mike Thompson had received a Bronze Star for his actions in Fallujah. Corporal Luis Ramirez was a decorated sniper with over 40 confirmed kills. Sergeant First Class David Park was a communications expert who had helped coordinate major operations across multiple theaters. These weren't weekend warriors or training camp recruits. These were elite soldiers with real combat experience and proven track records. Tomorrow, she would be training alongside them, competing with them, and ultimately being judged by the same standards they were held to. Sarah closed the files and began her evening routine. Push-ups, sit-ups, and stretching exercises that kept her body limber and strong. As she exercised, she thought about her grandfather's words. Water can carve through stone, not because it is strong, but because it never gives up. Tomorrow would be her chance to prove that strength came in many forms, and that the most dangerous opponents were often the ones you never saw coming. She had been underestimated her entire life, and every time, she had used that underestimation as a weapon. The Georgia heat would be brutal, the training would be punishing, and her teammates would be watching for any sign of weakness. But Sarah Chen had been preparing for this moment her entire life, even if she didn't know it at the time. As she drifted off to sleep, she smiled slightly. Tomorrow, 30 Marines were about to learn that their newest teammate was nothing like what they expected, and 5 of them were about to discover firsthand that sometimes the smallest person in the room is also the most dangerous. The alarm blared at 0500 hours, cutting through the humid Georgia air like a knife. Sarah had been awake for 10 minutes already, her internal clock finely tuned from years of disciplined training. She dressed quickly in her combat fatigues, laced her boots with military precision, and was standing at attention outside the barracks before most of her teammates had even processed the wake-up call. Drill Sergeant Martinez appeared like a storm cloud, his massive frame casting shadows across the assembled Marines. At 6'4" and built like a linebacker, he was the kind of man who commanded respect through sheer physical presence. His voice, when it came, could probably be heard 3 counties away. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Hell Week," Martinez announced, his eyes scanning the group with predatory intensity. "For the next 5 days, you will be pushed beyond your limits. You will be tested physically, mentally, and emotionally. Some of you will break, some of you will quit, and some of you might just discover what you're really made of." His gaze stopped on Sarah, standing perfectly still in the back row. "Today, we start with close quarters combat evaluation. Each of you will face multiple opponents in simulated combat scenarios. This isn't a game, people. This is as real as it gets without actual bullets flying." The group marched to the training facility, a state-of-the-art complex that included everything from shooting ranges to mock urban environments. The close-quarters combat area was designed to simulate real battlefield conditions, with concrete walls, steel obstacles, and enough space for realistic tactical movements. Sarah found herself surrounded by her new teammates as they waited for instructions. The conversations around her were exactly what she expected: war stories, boasts about previous training scores, and the kind of casual dismissal she had heard 1,000 times before. "So, Chen," said Staff Sergeant Thompson, a thick-set man from Alabama, with arms like tree trunks. "What's your background? You look pretty young to be here with us grizzled veterans." "Engineering," Sarah replied simply. "Graduated from UT, completed integrated combat training, and scored in the top 5% of my class." Thompson chuckled, and several others joined him. "Engineering, huh? Well, this ain't about building bridges, sweetheart. This is about breaking things and hurting people. Big difference." Sarah kept her expression neutral. "I understand the difference, Staff Sergeant. Do you?" This came from Corporal Ramirez, the sniper she had read about the night before. "Because I've seen plenty of book-smart soldiers freeze up when things get real. Combat isn't like your computer simulations." Before Sarah could respond, Sergeant First Class Park stepped into the conversation. Unlike the others, his tone was more curious than dismissive. "What kind of engineering, and why switch to infantry work?" "Mechanical engineering with a focus on robotics and systems integration," Sarah answered. "And I didn't switch. I see this as an evolution of the same principles, analyzing complex systems, identifying weaknesses, and finding optimal solutions." Park nodded thoughtfully. "That's actually not a bad way to think about combat, but theory and practice are different things." "They are," Sarah agreed. "That's why I'm here." The conversation was interrupted by Martinez's booming voice. "All right, warriors, time to see what you've got. We're going to start with one-on-one combat scenarios. Basic rules: no weapons, protective gear mandatory, fight until submission or knockout. Winner advances, loser does push-ups until I get bored watching. Watching prayer." He began calling out pairs, and Sarah watched carefully as her teammates demonstrated their skills. Thompson was a brawler, using his size and strength to overwhelm opponents. Ramirez was quick and precise, striking with surgical accuracy. Park combined discipline with unexpected power, clearly trained in multiple martial arts disciplines. Each fight lasted between 2 and 5 minutes, with the larger, more experienced Marines generally dominating. The few upsets that occurred were typically due to better technique overcoming raw strength. But even then, the victors were seasoned soldiers with extensive hand-to-hand combat training. Chen, you're up. Martinez called out after 20 minutes of combat. Your opponent will be Corporal Jackson. Sarah stepped forward, her heart rate steady despite the adrenaline beginning to flow through her system. Jackson was about average size for the group, maybe 5'10" inches and 180 pounds. But he moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years perfecting his fighting skills. Take it easy on me, Jackson said with a grin as they approached the center of the mat. I'll try not to hurt you too bad. Sarah said nothing, instead focusing on his stance, his balance, the way he held his hands. She had learned long ago that the first few seconds of any confrontation were crucial. People revealed everything about their fighting style in those initial moments. Their preferred attacks, their defensive instincts, their psychological approach to violence. Martinez raised his hand. Begin. Jackson moved forward confidently, throwing a traditional jab-cross combination that would have been effective against most opponents. But Sarah wasn't most opponents. She had spent years learning to use her size as an advantage rather than a disadvantage, and Jackson's attack played directly into her strengths. Instead of backing away or trying to block the punches, Sarah stepped forward and to the side, using Jackson's momentum against him. Her grandfather's Wing Chun training had taught her that the shortest distance between 2 points was rarely a straight line, especially in combat. She slipped past his lead hand and drove her elbow into his solar plexus with precise force. Jackson's breath exploded from his lungs as he doubled over, and Sarah immediately followed up with a knee to his face that sent him sprawling backward onto the mat. The entire sequence took less than 3 seconds. Jackson lay on his back, blood streaming from his nose, his eyes unfocused and confused. He tried to sit up, fell back down, and then slowly rolled onto his side, while shaking his head to clear it. The training area had gone completely silent. Martinez stared at the scene for a moment, then walked over to check on Jackson. You all right, Corporal? Yeah, Jackson mumbled, accepting help to stand up. I think so. What the hell happened? You got schooled, Martinez said bluntly. Chen, where did you learn to fight like that? My grandfather taught me Wing Chun from childhood, Sarah replied. I also wrestled in high school and studied Krav Maga in college, but mostly I learned to use physics to my advantage. Physics, Thompson called out from the sideline. What's that supposed to mean? Sarah turned to face the group, all of whom were now staring at her with considerably more attention than they had shown before. Force equals mass times acceleration. Corporal Jackson outweighs me by about 60 pounds, but I redirected his energy and added my own acceleration to it. The result was much more force than I could have generated on my own. That's real nice in theory, Thompson said, stepping forward. But Jackson's been having a tough week. Why don't you try that fancy science on someone who's actually paying attention? Martinez looked at Sarah questioningly. Chen? You want to go again? Sarah nodded without hesitation. Thompson was bigger than Jackson, stronger, and clearly more experienced. He was also angry now, which made him dangerous but also potentially careless. Thompson, you're up, Martinez called. Same rules apply. Thompson cracked his knuckles as he approached the center of the mat. Nothing personal, Chen. I just don't like seeing good Marines embarrassed by parlor tricks. This time, the entire group pressed forward to get a better view. Word had already spread about Jackson's quick defeat, and everyone wanted to see if Sarah could repeat her performance against a more formidable opponent. Thompson's approach was completely different from Jackson's. He didn't rush in with wild swings. Instead, he moved forward methodically, his hands up in a proper boxing stance, his feet positioned for maximum stability and power. When Martinez gave the signal to begin, Thompson advanced slowly and carefully. He threw a probing jab, testing Sarah's reactions. She slipped to the side, but Thompson was ready for it, immediately following up with a hook that forced her to duck low. For the first 30 seconds, it looked like Thompson's experience and caution would pay off. He kept Sarah at a distance, used his reach advantage effectively, and didn't give her the kind of opening that Jackson had provided. But Sarah was patient. She had learned from years of wrestling matches against bigger, stronger opponents that rushing was usually fatal. Instead, she waited, studied Thompson's patterns, and looked for the inevitable moment when his confidence would lead to a mistake. That moment came when Thompson decided to end the fight quickly. He loaded up for a powerful right cross, putting his full weight behind the punch. It was the kind of blow that could end a fight instantly if it connected. Sarah saw it coming from a mile away. Instead of moving backward, she stepped forward and to her left, inside Thompson's reach. His punch sailed harmlessly over her shoulder while she drove her shoulder into his ribs with all the force she could generate. Thompson's grunt of pain was audible throughout the training area, but Sarah wasn't finished. Using the wrestling techniques she had mastered in high school, she immediately transitioned from the shoulder strike to a hip toss that sent Thompson flying through the air. He landed hard on his back, the impact driving all the air from his lungs. Before he could recover, Sarah had moved into position above him, her knee pressed against his throat with just enough pressure to make breathing difficult. "Submission," Thompson gasped after a moment of struggle. Sarah immediately backed away, extending her hand to help him up. Thompson stared at her for a moment, then accepted her assistance with something that might have been respect. 2 for 2, Martinez announced to the group. "Anyone else want to test their skills against our engineering student?" The silence that followed was telling. Sarah could see the calculations going on in her teammates' minds. 2 quick victories could be explained away as luck, or their opponents being careless. But the techniques she had demonstrated were clearly the result of serious training and natural ability. Ramirez stepped forward. "I'll give it a try." If Thompson had been cautious, Ramirez was practically paranoid. The sniper's approach to hand-to-hand combat reflected his professional specialty: patience, precision, and the ability to exploit the smallest opportunities. For the first 2 minutes of their encounter, neither fighter gained a significant advantage. Ramirez had clearly studied Sarah's previous fights and adjusted his strategy accordingly. He stayed at range, used quick strikes to probe her defenses, and avoided giving her the kind of committed attacks that she could redirect. Sarah found herself working harder than she had in her previous fights. Ramirez was skilled, disciplined, and smart. He had identified her preferred techniques and was actively working to neutralize them. But patience was a game that Sarah had been playing her entire life. She continued to circle, to feint, and to wait for her opportunity. When it came, it was so subtle that most of the watching Marines missed it entirely. Ramirez shifted his weight slightly to his back foot while preparing for what he thought would be a winning combination. It was a tiny adjustment, barely perceptible, but it created a moment of instability that Sarah exploited instantly. She drove forward with explosive speed, sweeping Ramirez's front leg while simultaneously pushing his shoulders backward. The combination of forces sent him crashing to the ground, where Sarah immediately secured a chokehold that left him with no choice but to tap out. 3 down, Martinez announced, his voice carrying a note of genuine surprise. "Anyone else feeling brave?" This time, the silence stretched even longer. Sarah looked around at the faces of her teammates and saw something she had rarely encountered before: genuine respect mixed with wariness. They were beginning to understand that their assumptions about her had been not just wrong, but dangerously wrong. Park spoke up from the back of the group. "I think we're starting to see a pattern here, Drill Sergeant." Martinez nodded slowly. "Indeed we are, Park. Indeed we are." He turned to address the entire group. "What you've just witnessed, Marines, is why we never judge a book by its cover. Chen has just demonstrated that in combat, brains can be just as important as brawn, and that technique will beat raw power every single time." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But this is just the beginning. Hand-to-hand combat is only one aspect of what we do here. Tomorrow, we move on to weapons training, tactical scenarios, and the kind of high-pressure situations where lives are on the line." Sarah felt a familiar mixture of satisfaction and anticipation that came with exceeding expectations. She had proven herself in the first test, but she knew that her teammates would be much more prepared for her in future encounters. The element of surprise was gone now, but that was fine with her. Sarah Chen had never needed surprise to win. She had technique, intelligence, and the kind of determination that came from a lifetime of proving doubters wrong. As the group dispersed for lunch, she noticed that the conversations around her had changed tone completely. Instead of dismissive jokes, she heard serious discussions about fighting techniques and tactical applications. Her teammates were beginning to see her as a peer rather than an outsider. Thompson approached her as they walked back to the barracks. "Chen, that was some impressive fighting back there. Where exactly did you say you learnt all that?"
"My grandfather started teaching me when I was 6, Sarah replied.
"But most of it came from necessity. When you're small, you either learn to fight smart or you learn to run fast." "I chose to fight smart," Thompson nodded thoughtfully. "Well, you sure as hell caught us off guard. I'm not ashamed to admit that you're a better hand-to-hand fighter than I am." "Thank you, Staff Sergeant. But hand-to-hand combat is just one skill. I'm sure there are plenty of areas where you have more experience than I do." "Maybe," Thompson said with a grin. "But after today, I'm not making any assumptions about what you can and can't do." As they reached the dining facility, Sarah reflected on the morning's events. 3 fights, 3 victories, and the beginning of acceptance from her new teammates. But she also knew that the real tests were still ahead of her. Tomorrow would bring weapons training, tactical exercises, and the kind of complex scenarios that required not just individual skill but team coordination. Her teammates might be starting to respect her abilities, but respect in training was different from trust in combat. She would have to earn that trust one challenge at a time, just as she'd earned everything else in her life. But for the first time since arriving in Georgia, Sarah felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The afternoon would bring new challenges, new tests, and new opportunities to prove that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one nobody sees coming. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the weapons training range, turning the Georgia clay into a furnace that radiated heat waves in every direction. Sarah felt the sweat beading on her forehead as she stood with her teammates, all of them now regarding her with a mixture of curiosity and newfound caution after the morning's hand-to-hand combat demonstrations. Sergeant First Class Williams emerged from the equipment shed carrying an armful of M4 carbines, their black metal gleaming despite the coating of dust that seemed to cover everything on the base. Behind him came 2 other instructors wheeling carts loaded with ammunition, targets, and various pieces of tactical gear. "This afternoon, we're going to see how well you can shoot," Williams announced, his gravelly voice cutting through the humid air. "But this isn't going to be your typical marksmanship test. We're going to simulate real combat conditions, multiple targets, time pressure, and enough stress to separate the real shooters from the weekend warriors." He began distributing weapons, calling out each Marine's name as he handed them their rifle. When he reached Sarah, he paused for a moment, studying her with calculating eyes. "Chen, right? Heard you caused quite a stir this morning. Let's see if you can shoot as well as you can fight." Sarah accepted the M4 with practiced ease, immediately beginning the safety checks that had been drilled into her during training. Weapon orientation, chamber clear, magazine well empty, selector switch on safe. The rifle felt familiar in her hands despite being slightly different from the training weapons she had used during her program. Around her, the other Marines were conducting their own equipment checks, with the casual efficiency of people who had handled these weapons thousands of times. Sarah noticed that several of them were watching her, probably curious to see if her shooting skills matched her hand-to-hand combat abilities. "First exercise is going to be basic marksmanship," Williams continued. 200 meters, 10 rounds, prone position. This will establish your baseline scores before we move on to the real challenges. The group moved to the firing line, spreading out along the concrete barrier that separated the shooters from the target area. Sarah found herself positioned between Park and a Marine she hadn't met yet, a quiet, intense-looking man named Corporal Davis, who had been observing her all morning without saying a word. "You ever shoot competitively?" Park asked as they settled into their prone positions. "Some," Sarah replied, adjusting her scope and checking her sight picture. "Mostly precision shooting in college, but I understand combat shooting is different." "Very different." Davis spoke up for the first time, his voice carrying a slight accent that Sarah couldn't quite place. "Competition shooting is about perfection. Combat shooting is about speed and effectiveness under pressure." Williams's voice boomed across the range. "Shooters, you have 60 seconds to engage 10 targets. Targets will appear at random intervals. Each target will be visible for exactly 3 seconds. Miss your window, miss your shot." Ready on the firing line? Sarah settled into her shooting position, controlling her breathing and clearing her mind of everything except the fundamentals her instructors had taught her. Steady position, sight alignment, breathing control, trigger squeeze. The same principles applied whether she was shooting for precision or speed. "Commence firing!" The first target popped up at the 2 o'clock position. Sarah acquired it quickly, lined up her shot, and squeezed the trigger in one smooth motion. The target dropped immediately, and she was already swinging her rifle to the left where the second target had appeared. For the next 55 seconds, Sarah moved through the exercise with mechanical precision. Each target that appeared was identified, engaged, and neutralized before disappearing. Her movements were economical, efficient, and deadly accurate. When the exercise concluded, Williams called for weapons safe and walked down the line to check targets through his binoculars. Sarah could hear him calling out scores as he moved from position to position. "Thompson, 7 hits out of 10. "Not bad, but you need to work on your target acquisition time." "Ramirez, 9 out of 10. "Excellent shooting." "Park, 8 out of 10. "Good work." He stopped at Sarah's position and raised his binoculars. For a long moment he said nothing, just stared downrange at her target. Finally, he lowered the binoculars and looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. "Chen, 10 out of 10. All shots center mass. Outstanding shooting." He paused, then added, "Where exactly did you learn to shoot like that?" "College rifle team," Sarah replied. "We practice precision shooting at distances up to 500 meters. But I also spent a lot of time at tactical shooting courses during my military training." Williams nodded slowly. "Well, whatever you've been doing, keep doing it. That was some of the cleanest shooting I've seen in a while." Sarah could feel the eyes of her teammates on her again, and she heard Thompson mutter something under his breath that sounded like, "Unbelievable." She was beginning to understand that each successful performance was raising the stakes for the next challenge. "All right, people," Williams called out. "That was the warm-up. Now we're going to see how you handle some real pressure." The next exercise was considerably more complex. Instead of stationary targets at a known distance, the Marines would be moving through a course that simulated an urban combat environment. Targets would appear at varying distances, some would be partially concealed, and some would be moving. Additionally, they would be carrying full combat gear and would have to navigate obstacles while engaging threats. This course is designed to test your ability to shoot accurately while under physical and mental stress. Williams explained as they moved to the starting position. "You'll be timed, scored on accuracy, and penalized for any safety violations or civilian casualties." Sarah strapped on her tactical vest, adjusted her helmet, and checked her equipment one final time. The added weight and bulk of the combat gear changed everything about how she moved and aimed, but her training had prepared her for exactly these conditions. "Chen, you're up first," Williams announced. Sarah approached the starting line, her rifle at the ready position. The course stretched out before her, a maze of concrete barriers, wooden walls, and metal obstacles designed to simulate a hostile urban environment. She could see several target mechanisms positioned throughout the course, but she knew that the real challenges would be the ones she couldn't see yet. "Your mission is simple," Williams said. "Move through the course, engage all hostile targets, avoid civilian casualties, and complete the course in under 5 minutes. Ready?" Sarah nodded, her mind already analyzing the course layout and planning her route of movement. "Begin." She moved forward at a controlled jog, her rifle up and ready. The first target appeared immediately, a standard silhouette that popped up from behind a concrete barrier at about 50 meters. Sarah dropped to one knee, acquired the target, and fired, in one fluid motion. The target fell, and she was already moving toward the next obstacle. The course demanded constant mental calculations. Distance to target, wind conditions, optimal shooting position, route planning, and threat assessment all had to be processed simultaneously while maintaining physical control and weapon safety. Sarah found herself drawing on every aspect of her training, the engineering mindset that allowed her to analyze complex systems quickly, the martial arts discipline that kept her body under control, and the shooting skills she had developed through years of practice. Target after target fell as she moved through the course, a moving target at 75 meters that required her to lead her shot. A partially concealed target that demanded precise shot placement to avoid the civilian decoy positioned next to it. A close-range target that appeared suddenly as she rounded a corner, testing her reflexes and close-quarters shooting abilities. With 30 seconds remaining on the clock, Sarah approached the final obstacle, a 2-story wooden structure that simulated a building-clearing scenario. She could see movement in several windows, but she had to determine which were threats and which were civilians before engaging. She moved to the base of the structure and began systematically clearing each window. First floor left, hostile target, engaged and neutralized. First floor right, civilian, no shot taken. Second floor center, hostile target partially concealed behind what appeared to be a desk, engaged with a precise headshot. As she approached the final corner of the course, Sarah heard Williams calling out her time. 4 minutes, 15 seconds. Outstanding time, Chen. But she wasn't finished yet. The final challenge was a stress shooter scenario. 5 targets at varying distances that would appear simultaneously for just 2 seconds. She had to identify and engage all 5 targets in that brief window, requiring not just accuracy, but incredible speed and decision-making ability. Sarah positioned herself at the designated firing point and controlled her breathing. Her heart rate had increased during the course, and she needed to compensate for the adrenaline affecting her fine motor control. Final targets appearing in 3, 2, 1, now. 5 targets popped up across a 180-degree arc. Close target at 25 meters, medium targets at 50 and 75 meters, and long targets at 100 and 125 meters. Sarah's rifle moved in a smooth arc from left to right, engaging each target with methodical precision. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Each shot was fired with the same controlled trigger squeeze, the The same steady sight picture, the same fundamental techniques she had practiced thousands of times. When the targets dropped, silence fell over the range. Williams was already moving downrange with his binoculars, checking each target for shot placement. Sarah ejected her magazine, cleared her chamber, and put her weapon on safe while she waited for the results. "Ladies and gentlemen," Williams called out after several minutes of inspection, "we have a perfect score. All targets engaged, all shots center mass, no civilian casualties, course completed in 4 minutes and 18 seconds. The silence that followed was different from the sharp silence of the morning. This was the silence of professionals recognizing exceptional performance in their own field. Thompson was the first to speak. "Chen, that was some of the best shooting I've ever seen. And I've served with some pretty impressive shooters over the years." "Thank you, Staff Sergeant. But I had some advantages. The engineering background helped me calculate the ballistics quickly, and the martial arts training helped me maintain body control under stress." Davis stepped forward, his intense gaze fixed on Sarah. "It wasn't just technical skill. You have natural instincts for this kind of work. The way you moved through that course, the speed of your threat assessment, that's not something you can teach." Sarah appreciated the compliment, but she also understood the implications. Each successful performance was raising expectations and increasing the pressure for future challenges. Her teammates were beginning to see her as more than just a competent soldier. They were starting to see her as someone who might actually be better than they were. "All right, people," Williams called out. "Chen has set the bar pretty high. Who wants to try to match that performance?" Over the next 2 hours, Sarah watched as each of her teammates attempted the course. They were all competent shooters with solid fundamental skills, but none of them approached her level of performance. Thompson was strong and aggressive but lacked precision under pressure. Ramirez was accurate but too cautious, missing several time-sensitive targets. Park was technically proficient but struggled with the physical demands of the course while wearing full gear. By the time the last Marine had completed the exercise, Sarah's score remained untouched. She had achieved something that none of these experienced warriors had been able to match, despite their years of training and combat experience. As they cleaned their weapons and prepared to return to the barracks, Sarah noticed that the dynamic within the group had shifted again. The respectful wariness of the morning had evolved into something more complex, a mixture of admiration, curiosity, and perhaps a touch of concern. These Marines were beginning to understand that their new teammate wasn't just competent or even exceptional. Sarah Chen might actually be in a category by herself. Martinez appeared as they were finishing their equipment maintenance. "Chen, the Colonel wants to see you in his office after dinner. Don't keep him waiting." Sarah nodded, wondering what Colonel Morrison wanted to discuss. She suspected it had something to do with her performance over the past day, but she couldn't be sure whether it was positive or negative attention. As they walked back to the barracks, Park fell into step beside her. "You know, Chen, I've been thinking about what you said this morning, about using physics and systems thinking in combat. What about it? I think you might be onto something. The way you approach these challenges, it's different from how the rest of us have been trained to think. You're not just reacting to situations, you're analyzing them and finding optimal solutions." Sarah considered his words carefully. "I think modern warfare requires both approaches. The traditional warrior skills are still essential, but we're also facing more complex challenges that require analytical thinking." "Maybe," Park said. "But I've never seen anyone combine the two approaches as effectively as you do. It's like watching someone play chess while everyone else is playing checkers." That evening, as Sarah prepared for her meeting with Colonel Morrison, she reflected on the day's events. 2 major challenges, 2 clear victories, and a growing sense that she was being evaluated for something more significant than just training performance. She had come to Georgia expecting to prove herself capable of keeping up with elite Marines. Instead, she was discovering that she might be capable of leading them. Tomorrow would bring new tests, new challenges, and new opportunities to demonstrate her abilities. But tonight, she had a meeting with a colonel who was beginning to understand that his assumptions about female soldiers might need some serious revision. The real question was whether the Marine Corps was ready for what Sarah Chen had to offer. Colonel Morrison's office was exactly what Sarah expected from a career Marine officer. Clean, functional, and decorated with the kind of memorabilia that told the story of a life spent in service. Combat photographs, unit citations, and a collection of challenge coins from various deployments covered one wall, while the opposite wall displayed his degrees and military education certificates. Morrison himself sat behind a heavy wooden desk, studying a file that Sarah assumed contained her performance reports from the past 2 days. He was older than she had initially realized, probably in his early 50s, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that came from decades of outdoor military life. "Sit down, Chen," he said without looking up from the file. "We need to talk." Sarah took the chair across from his desk and waited. She had learned early in her military training that senior officers appreciated brevity and directness, so she remained silent until Morrison was ready to begin the conversation. After several minutes, Morrison closed the file and looked directly at her. "I've been in the Marine Corps for 32 years. I've trained thousands of soldiers, led men in combat across 4 different theaters, and I thought I had seen every type of warrior this organization could produce." He paused, leaning back in his chair. "And then you show up and make me question everything I thought I knew about what makes an effective soldier." Sarah remained silent, uncertain whether this was praise or criticism. "Your performance over the past 2 days has been remarkable," Morrison continued. "But remarkable in a way that concerns me. You're not just competent, you're exceptional. And exceptional soldiers present unique challenges for command." "Sir, I'm not sure I understand." Morrison leaned forward. "Chen, in 32 years of service, I've seen maybe a dozen soldiers who possess the kind of natural ability you've demonstrated. You want to know what happened to them?" Sarah nodded. "Half of them washed out because they couldn't handle the pressure of being the best. The other half became legends. The question is, which category are you going to fall into?" He stood up and walked to the window overlooking the training grounds. "Tomorrow, we're conducting the final exercise of Hell Week. It's called the Crucible, and it's designed to push elite soldiers beyond their breaking point. Most years, we have a failure rate of about 30%. Sarah waited for him to continue. "But this year, I'm making some modifications to the exercise. Instead of the usual scenario, we're going to run a special operations simulation. You'll be leading a team of 5 Marines on a hostage rescue mission in a simulated urban environment. The mission parameters are classified, but I can tell you that it will test every skill you've demonstrated over the past 2 days, plus a few you haven't encountered yet." Morrison returned to his desk and fixed Sarah with an intense stare. "Here's the thing, Chen. The 5 Marines you'll be leading are volunteers who specifically requested to work under your command after seeing your performance this week. These are experienced combat veterans who are willing to follow someone they've known for 3 days into what will essentially be a controlled combat simulation." Sarah felt a mixture of pride and apprehension. "Sir, I'm honored by their confidence, but I don't have any experience leading troops in combat situations." "No, you don't," Morrison agreed. "But you have something else, the ability to think clearly under pressure, and the kind of tactical instincts that can't be taught. The question is whether you can translate individual excellence into team leadership." He picked up another file from his desk. "The 5 Marines who volunteered are Thompson, Ramirez, Park, Davis, and a communications specialist named Wilson. All experienced soldiers, all with combat deployments, and all convinced that you're someone they want to follow." Sarah processed this information carefully. "What exactly will this exercise involve, sir?" "Classified, as I said. But I can tell you that you'll be facing multiple hostile forces, civilian complications, and time-critical decision-making. The scenario is designed to simulate the kind of high-stakes special operations that our elite units face in real-world deployments." Morrison stood up again, signaling that the meeting was coming to an end. "Chen, I want you to understand something. This exercise isn't just about testing your abilities. It's about determining whether you have the potential to join the most elite units in the Marine Corps. The kind of units that handle the missions no one else can handle." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "Sir, are you suggesting that I might be considered for special operations?" "I'm suggesting that your performance over the next 24 hours will determine whether you have a future as a conventional soldier or something much more significant. The Marine Corps is always looking for exceptional talent, but exceptional talent that can lead other exceptional soldiers is incredibly rare." He walked to the door and opened it. "Get some rest, Chen. Tomorrow is going to be the most important day of your military career." As Sarah left the colonel's office, her mind was racing with possibilities and concerns. She had come to Georgia hoping to prove herself capable of serving alongside elite Marines. Now she was being given the opportunity to lead them in a scenario that could determine the entire trajectory of her military career. That evening, she found herself in the common area of the barracks with the 5 Marines who had volunteered to serve under her command in the next day's exercise. The atmosphere was different from the casual conversation of previous evenings. These soldiers were treating her as their commanding officer, seeking her guidance and input on tactical planning. "So Chen," Thompson said, spreading a map of the training facility across the table, "any thoughts on how you want to approach tomorrow's exercise?" Sarah studied the map carefully, noting the various structures and terrain features. "Without knowing the specific mission parameters, it's hard to develop a detailed plan. But I think our strength will be in adaptability and communication."
What do you mean? Asked Wilson, the communications specialist she had just met that evening.
Each of you brings different skills and experience to the team, Sarah explained.
Thompson has close quarters combat expertise, Ramirez has precision shooting and reconnaissance abilities, Park understands tactical movement and coordination, Davis has urban warfare experience, and Wilson handles communications and technical systems. She pointed to different areas on the map. Whatever mission we're given, we'll need to leverage all of these capabilities while maintaining flexibility to adapt to changing conditions. Davis leaned forward. That sounds good in theory, but how do you plan to coordinate all of that in a high-stress situation? Most of us have only worked together in training scenarios. It was a valid concern, and Sarah had been thinking about it since leaving Morrison's office. I think our advantage is going to be in clear communication and trust. We've seen each other perform under pressure over the past few days, so we know what each person is capable of. Tomorrow, we focus on supporting each other's strengths and covering each other's weaknesses. Ramirez nodded slowly. I like the approach. Simple, flexible, and based on proven abilities rather than untested theories. Park added, the key is going to be decision-making under pressure. In special operations scenarios, the situation can change rapidly, and the team leader has to be able to adapt the plan without losing effectiveness. Sarah appreciated the input, but she also understood the subtext. These Marines were expressing confidence in her abilities, but they were also making it clear that they expected competent leadership. Tomorrow would test whether her individual skills could translate into effective command. The next morning arrived with the kind of oppressive heat that made everything more difficult. Sarah woke before dawn and spent an hour reviewing tactical manuals and studying the base layout. She had no idea what specific challenges she would face, but she wanted to be as prepared as possible. At 080 hours, her team assembled in the briefing room where Colonel Morrison and several other senior officers waited with sealed mission packets. Ladies and gentlemen, Morrison began, you are about to undertake a classified hostage rescue simulation. The scenario is based on real-world operations, and the stakes are as close to actual combat as we can make them in a training environment. He handed Sarah a sealed envelope. Chen, you are the mission commander. Your team has 30 minutes to plan, and then you'll have 4 hours to complete the mission. Failure is not an option. Sarah opened the envelope and quickly scanned the mission briefing. The scenario was more complex than anything she had encountered in training. A group of enemy combatants had taken hostages in a simulated embassy compound. The hostages included civilians and military personnel, and intelligence suggested that the captors were planning to execute them within 4 hours. The compound was heavily defended, with multiple entry points, various levels of fortification, and an unknown number of hostile forces. Additionally, there were civilian non-combatants in the area who could not be harmed during the rescue operation. This is what we're facing, Sarah said, spreading the mission materials across the table for her team to review. Multiple objectives, time pressure, civilian constraints, and an unknown enemy force. Thompson studied the compound layout. This is going to require perfect coordination. Any mistakes and people die, real or simulated? Davis asked. For the purposes of this exercise, Morrison answered, consider all casualties to be real. The evaluation criteria are based on mission success, team effectiveness, and leadership under extreme pressure. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. This wasn't just about proving her individual abilities anymore. She was responsible for leading 5 experienced Marines through a scenario that would test every aspect of their training and her leadership capabilities. All right, team, she said, looking each of her Marines in the eye. We have 30 minutes to plan and 4 hours to execute. Let's get to work. The planning session was intense and focused. Sarah drew on every aspect of her training, the analytical thinking from her engineering background, the tactical knowledge from her military education, and the leadership principles she had studied, but never applied in real situations. Wilson, I need you to establish Overwatch communications and monitor all enemy frequencies. Ramirez, you'll provide sniper support from the building across the street. Thompson and Davis will breach the compound together while Park coordinates our movement and watches for civilian complications.
Each Marine contributed their expertise to refine the plan.
Ramirez identified optimal sniper positions, Thompson suggested breach points and clearing procedures, Davis provided insights into urban combat tactics, Park analyzed movement routes and timing, and Wilson outlined communication protocols. By the end of the planning session, they had developed a comprehensive approach that leveraged each team member's strengths while maintaining the flexibility to adapt to unexpected developments. Remember, Sarah told her team as they prepared to deploy, the mission is to rescue the hostages. neutralize the threats, and protect civilian lives. Everything else is secondary. The story of how one underestimated woman wiped out 5 Marines in training became the story of how she transformed not just their perceptions, but the entire understanding of what modern military leadership could look like. Sarah Chen had proven that the most dangerous opponents are often the ones hiding in plain sight, and that sometimes the best leaders are the ones no one sees coming. In a world where strength was often measured by size and experience by years of service, she had demonstrated that intelligence, determination, and the willingness to never give up could overcome any obstacle. Her grandfather had been right about water carving through stone. What he hadn't mentioned was that sometimes the water becomes something stronger than stone in the process.